No one wanted the beaten and wounded $2 Apache slave until the lonely cowboy chose her as family. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The Arizona sun sat low in the late afternoon sky, sharp light cutting across the trading post yard where wagons stood hitched, and the smell of horses, tobacco, and spilled whiskey hung thick in the air. Dust shifted with every boot step, clinging to the sweat-darkened shirts of the men who lingered in a half-circle. They weren't there for business anymore. They were there for spectacle. At the center of the yard, a ranch hand half-drunk on cheap whiskey pulled forward a young Apache woman. His boots dug furrows into the dirt as he yanked her by a rope tied cruelly around her wrists. His shirt was stained at the collar, hair plastered with sweat, and he laughed in short bursts that only made his words more jagged. $2. That's all she's worth. Two damn dollars. Strong enough to clean, cook, haul water, or whatever else a man might need. His voice was coarse and loud, forcing the moment to hold. The woman stumbled as he shoved her, landing hard in the dirt, her thin dress slipping further down one shoulder. She tried to catch herself with bound hands, but only scraped her palms raw. She stayed on her knees for a moment, her chest rising fast, before she pushed herself up again, face turned down, long black hair falling forward to hide the cuts and swelling across her cheek. The dress was torn nearly through at the side, ripped along the neckline where the fabric had given way under rough handling. Her bare skin showed bruises and patches, blue, yellow, and angry purple, marks of boots, fists, and days without care. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, not from shame, but from survival. Meeting their stares would only feed them. Some men in the crowd spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Others chuckled, but none stepped forward. One muttered, "Not worth the feed it'd take," and walked off toward the saloon. Another shook his head, muttering something about trouble. The drunken ranch hand cursed, jerking the rope again. $2. She's young, she's strong. What the hell's the matter with you cowards? For the woman, every word landed like another lash. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed hard and stayed quiet. She had no choice. Running would mean a bullet. Speaking would mean a blow. Her heart thumped fast, but steady, and she told herself to keep breathing, to stay on her feet. At the edge of the yard stood Ethan Cole, 34 years old, broad-shouldered, dark hair tucked beneath a sweat-stained hat. His face was marked by trail dust and a scar that cut from cheekbone to jawline, a reminder of his time as a Union scout during the war. He had come into town for supplies, flour, coffee, new shoes for his horse. He preferred to keep his distance from men and their cruelty, but he hadn't walked away yet. He watched the ranch hand and the jeering crowd with the same steady stillness he'd carried since the war, his jaw set, his eyes narrow under the brim of his hat. He'd seen enough cruelty on both sides of the conflict to last a lifetime, and this scene played out too familiar. A life offered cheap, as if it were nothing. Ethan wasn't a man who rushed decisions. He weighed them like a horseman weighs weather before a long ride, measured, slow, and deliberate. But standing there, watching the woman's hands tremble as she tried to keep herself upright, something stirred in him that would not be reasoned away. He could almost hear the voices of his past, officers barking orders, men begging for mercy, and he knew this was not something he would stand by and ignore. His hand brushed against the coins in his pocket. $2 silver. He planned to save them for nails and lamp oil, but he understood now that this was not about trade. This was about ending something before it marked her forever. He stepped forward, boots scraping the hard ground. The crowd shifted, quieting. The ranch hand looked up, grinning like he'd finally won. Ethan stopped close, his shadow falling across both seller and woman. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and laid $2 into the man's filthy palm. The coins clinked heavy in the silence. The ranch hand looked startled, then pleased. "Now, that's more like it." Ethan said nothing. His hand went to his belt, drawing a knife. The woman flinched, heart hammering, thinking for one desperate instant that this new man was no different, that he'd paid not to save but to own. But Ethan lowered the blade to the rope at her wrists and cut it clean. The rope fell away, leaving red welts on her skin. She lifted her head slightly, not enough to meet his eyes, but enough to see his hand slide the knife back into its sheath. No groping, no shove, no command. Just a quiet gesture that left her standing free. The ranch hand muttered something about getting rid of trouble and stumbled back toward the saloon, already forgetting the woman he'd sold off like livestock. The crowd dissolved with him, men turning away one by one, leaving only dust and silence behind. Ethan looked at the woman for the first time. Her lips were split, her breath shallow, her body swaying slightly as though one wrong step would bring her down. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask her story. He simply placed a steady hand at her elbow and guided her toward his mule. Her thoughts spun as she tried to grasp what had just happened. She wanted to resist, to pull away, but her body had no strength left. Part of her whispered that this was just another man, another chain, but something in his silence felt different. His grip was firm but not cruel, guiding, not forcing. She hadn't felt that in years. Ethan lifted her gently onto the mule's back, his movements careful not to jar her bruised ribs, and tied down the saddlebags. He took the reins in his hand and began leading the mule toward the road that cut north toward the hills. He didn't speak. She didn't either. Their silence was heavy but not hostile. Both carried too much behind their ribs to share with strangers. As the trading post fell behind them, the woman held the saddle horn and told herself to keep breathing. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't waiting to be struck. She wasn't waiting to be sold again. And Ethan Cole, the quiet cowboy with no family and too many ghosts, told himself he would see this through. Not because it was easy, but because he knew that leaving her there would be a weight he could never carry. The sun lowered behind the hills, shadows stretching long across the road, and two figures, one broken, one scarred, moved steadily away from the jeers and dust of the yard toward a cabin neither yet knew would change them both. The mule carried them north along the wash until the sun dipped low and the desert began to cool, the heat sliding away and leaving the air sharp with the smell of creosote and dry sage. The road narrowed into little more than a trail, winding between scrub and scattered cottonwoods, the ground pale with dust that glowed faintly in the last light. Sanaa swayed in the saddle, gripping the horn with sore hands, her body aching with every step of the mule. She wanted to ask where he was taking her, who he was, why he had done what no other man bothered to do, but her throat stayed dry, and she watched the set of his shoulders instead, broad and steady, his hand firm on the reins as he walked in silence beside her. Ethan Cole had not meant to leave town with more than a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. Yet here he was leading a mule that now carried a woman instead of goods. He felt the old weight pressing down, the same weight he'd felt when he looked across battlefields years ago, when men's lives could be bought and sold in decisions made by those who stood above them. He had told himself when the war ended that he'd keep to himself, avoid people, avoid the pain that always followed them. But today, standing in that trading post yard, he'd known he would not sleep at night if he left her there. That was reason enough. The cabin came into sight after an hour's climb. It stood against a low ridge where cottonwoods grew thicker, their leaves whispering in the evening breeze. The building was plain, one room of pine logs chinked with mud, a roof shingled tight, smoke rising weak from a stovepipe. A small corral stretched to one side, with two lean cows inside, and beyond that the faint outline of tilled earth where beans and corn had once grown. It was not much, but it was his, and for the first time, Ethan wondered what it would look like through another's eyes. He lifted Sanaa down from the mule carefully. Her breath hitched when his hands brushed her ribs, but he let go quickly, stepping back to give her space. She stood unsteady in the yard, her dress torn and hanging loose, dust clinging to her skin. Her eyes flicked to the door, then to him, and he realized she didn't know if she was free or traded into another kind of captivity. Inside, he said quietly, not as command, but as invitation, and then he pushed the door open and stepped aside. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee gone cold. A narrow bed sat against the far wall, a folded blanket at its foot. A rough-hewn table stood by the stove, two chairs beside it, one well-worn from years of his use. His rifle leaned in the corner, his boots and gear lined neatly along the wall. It was not the place of a man expecting company, and he felt the plainness of it now, as though it might make her uneasy. Sanaa stood in the doorway, her shoulders tight, scanning the room as though weighing whether it was safer inside or back out in the empty land. She thought of the men in town, of the ranch hand's filthy grip, of the eyes that had judged her body like meat, and though fear pressed her ribs, she stepped inside. At least here, there were walls and no crowd. Ethan set the flour sack and coffee on the table, then reached into a small chest and pulled out a bar of soap and a folded cotton shirt. He placed them on the bed without a word. Sanaa looked from the items to him, her brow drawn. For a long moment, she thought it was a trick, that he meant her to wash and then give herself to him. Her heart thudded against her bruised chest, and she felt her hands clench at her sides. But Ethan turned away, moved to the stove, and began stoking the fire. He set water to boil, his back to her, shoulders hunched slightly, not watching, not pressing. She studied him, waiting for the demand that never came. Slowly, her breathing eased. She picked up the soap with trembling fingers, ran her hand across the shirt. It was coarse cotton, worn but clean. She realized he had nothing else to offer. This was simply all he had. Ethan sat down in the chair by the stove, tipping his hat low. "You can wash," he said, voice flat but not unkind. "I'll stay put." He didn't look at her as he spoke, and she caught the meaning. Privacy, choice, things she hadn't been given in a long time. She washed with the basin and cloth, the heat of the water stinging as it ran over her split lip and the cuts on her arms. The dirt and blood lifted, leaving her skin raw but clean. When she pulled on the shirt, it hung loose over her frame, falling below her knees, covering the torn dress she folded into a bundle. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she did not feel eyes on her body. Ethan listened to the scrape of the cloth, the quiet shift of water, his thoughts circling. He had not planned for this. He had not thought beyond the trading post yard. He knew nothing of her story, why she had been tied, who had beaten her where she belonged. But he also knew that pressing questions now would break the fragile quiet they'd found. She would speak if and when she wanted to. When she finished, Sanaa moved to the edge of the bed and sat, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She looked at Ethan then, finally letting her eyes lift to his face. He wasn't watching her. He stared into the stove fire instead, his scar pale in the glow, his jaw set. She realized he was just as worn as she was, though in a different way. For a moment, she thought about asking why. Why he'd spent his money, why he had cut the rope, why he hadn't left her in the dirt like everyone else. The words hovered in her throat, but she let them go. For now, silence was easier. Ethan leaned back in the chair, arms crossed loosely. "Get some rest," he said, not raising his voice. "You'll need it." Sanaa eased down onto the bed, pulling the blanket over herself. The cotton shirt smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. She turned to the wall, clutching the blanket edge in both hands. Her body stayed tense for a long while, waiting for footsteps, for a hand reaching for her. None came. She heard the creak of the chair as he shifted, the quiet sigh of boots settling near the stove. He wasn't moving closer. He was keeping watch. Her heart slowed. Her breath steadied. In the quiet of that small cabin, with firelight flickering against the logs and no jeers in her ears, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Safety, fragile but real. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and Ethan sat with his hat tipped low, eyes half shut but ears sharp, guarding the room until the night turned deep. Morning light slipped in through the cracks of the shutters, laying pale stripes across the cabin floor. The stove had burned down to coals, leaving the air cool enough that breath showed faintly when Ethan exhaled. He had dozed only in short spells through the night, keeping his chair near the stove, boots planted firm on the floor. Years of scouting during the war had trained him to sleep light, and it never left him. When he finally stirred upright, the sound woke Sanaa. She opened her eyes slowly, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, her chest tightening with panic. But then she saw the cabin walls, the bed beneath her, and Ethan at the stove. Her breath eased a little. The question that had followed her into sleep came back. Was this man just another waiting for the right moment? Or was he truly different? Ethan poured water into the kettle and set on the stove. He could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't turn. He wanted to give her space, let her settle before pushing too much. He spoke without looking. Coffee will be ready in a bit. There's bread and beans too. His voice was even, not coaxing, not demanding, just the same plain tone he always carried. Sanaa sat up slowly, legs still sore, ribs aching. She pulled the cotton shirt closer around herself, remembering the torn dress she had folded and left near the bed. Her mind turned over the same questions. Why had he bought her? Why had he said nothing of what he expected? Every man she'd ever known had wanted something. This silence was unfamiliar and unsettling. She watched as Ethan took bread from a tin, sliced it, and placed it on a plate. His movements were practical, steady, as though he'd done it 1,000 times the same way. He set the plate on the table and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, but finally crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Her hands shook when she reached for the bread, not from hunger alone, but from nerves, waiting for him to speak or make a claim. Instead, Ethan picked up his own slice, ate quietly, and left the space open. The silence stretched, but it wasn't sharp. It was almost steadying. After a while, he said, "You'll need a dress that fits. That one's no good anymore." His eyes flicked briefly to the folded bundle of torn cloth. "I'll ride to town later in the week." He didn't ask her size, didn't press. He said it as if it were already decided, a practical matter. Sanaa studied him, unsure of what to make of a man who bought a woman out of a trading yard but then gave her food, space, and even talk of clothes. Her heart pulled in two directions, suspicion on one side, a cautious spark of trust on the other. She tested him with a small question, her voice rough from disuse. "Why did you pay?" Ethan paused, setting down his coffee cup. He met her eyes for the first time, steady but not hard. "Because leaving you there would have been wrong. $2 didn't matter. You did." He didn't add more. He didn't try to sound noble or gentle. Just truth, plain and simple. She held his gaze for a moment before looking down. The answer was too direct to be a trick, and something inside her shifted. She realized he wasn't going to explain himself further. He wasn't a man who spoke more than he had to. Later that afternoon, Ethan carried in wood for the stove. When he set the pile down near the wall, he saw Sanaa move toward the small chest where his trail coat lay. Without asking, she picked up needle and thread from the shelf and began to repair a tear in the lining. Ethan stopped for a moment, watching. It was the first time she had chosen to act on her own since stepping into the cabin. He didn't say anything, but inside he felt a faint easing in his chest. Maybe she was beginning to see this place as more than a stop on her way to nowhere. That evening, the fire burned warm, casting shadows against the log walls. Sanaa sat near the table with a mended coat folded beside her, her hands resting on her lap. Ethan sat across from her, sharpening his knife with slow, steady strokes. The sound filled the silence between them. She thought about what he'd said earlier, about $2 not matching. She thought about the way he'd kept his distance, the way he hadn't touched her without reason. Something told her he deserved more than silence. Her chest tightened as she waited. Speaking her name had always been a risk. Names could be used, twisted, held against you. But here, in this cabin, with his eyes steady in the firelight, she felt the weight of holding it back more than the risk of sharing it. "My name." Her voice caught, but she pressed on. "Sanaa." Ethan looked up from the knife. He repeated it once, firm and even. "Sanaa." Then he gave a single nod and went back to the blade. He didn't press her for more, didn't ask where she came from or what had been done to her. Just acknowledged it, as though a name alone was enough for now. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sanaa felt herself seen not as a body, not as a burden, but as a person. That thought stayed with her as she pulled the blanket over herself later that night. She lay listening to the stove tick as it cooled, Ethan's chair creaking faintly as he shifted near the fire. The fear that had ruled her every breath since the trading post eased just a little, replaced by something unfamiliar. Not safety yet, not trust, but the beginning of both. By the end of the week, the flour sack was almost empty. The coffee tin held only enough for one more pot, and the salt barrel scraped near the bottom. Ethan had known since the first morning that this trip into town couldn't be avoided, but he had waited, giving Sanaa time to heal, to gather strength. Supplies were not a choice, they were survival. He told her the night before in his usual steady voice, "We ride to town tomorrow. Need flour, coffee, maybe boots." It wasn't phrased as a request, but not as a command either. It was fact. Sanaa had felt her chest tighten at the words. The image of the trading post yard still burned into her mind. The rope at her wrists, the laughter, the spit at her feet. She had wondered every day if the town would remember, if faces would sneer, if someone would try to take her back. But she nodded anyway, because she knew he was right. Food would not appear on its own. She told herself she would walk beside him, not behind. The next morning, Ethan saddled the mule and his gelding, checked straps twice, and tied the empty flour sack across the saddle horn. He handed Sanaa a shawl he had found in his chest, plain wool, but serviceable. "Wear this," he said. "Wind'll bite." She wrapped it tight around her shoulders, hiding the thin cotton shirt he had given her days ago. Her old dress, torn beyond modesty, had been cut into rags and burned. She wore it no more. The trail into town was long enough for her thoughts to churn. She wondered about Ethan as much as about herself. Why had a man who lived alone in a cabin care enough to interfere? Did he expect something she hadn't yet understood? He had not touched her except when helping her down from the mule, had not pressed her for her story, had not asked for her body. That alone set him apart from every man she had known in the last year. She did not trust easily, but she could not deny that with every day she spent in his cabin, her fear eased in small degrees. Town came into sight by mid-morning. Sunlight glinting off windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the clatter of wagons, and the voices of men carrying across the street. Sanaa felt her stomach knot. She adjusted the shawl tighter, her fingers gripping the edge until her knuckles hurt. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. He simply kept his horse steady beside her mule, his hand resting loosely on the reins, his body close enough that no one could mistake she was alone. They tied up at the hitch rail outside the general store. Eyes turned immediately. A ranch hand leaning against a post narrowed his gaze, whispering something to the man beside him. A pair of women paused on the boardwalk, one clutching her basket tighter, the other tugging at her sleeve as if to pull her along. Sanaa felt the weight of every stare like stones pressing into her skin. She wanted to vanish back into the desert. Ethan stepped down first, then offered her his hand. She hesitated, the shame of that yard rushing back, but when she met his eyes, she saw no impatience, no mockery, just steady expectation. She placed her hand in his and let him help her down. Standing beside him, she straightened her shoulders. If they saw her, they would see her as someone who belonged to his side, not as a thing to be sold. Inside the store, the air smelled of flour, leather, and lamp oil. Shelves lined with tins of beans, bolts of cloth, and jars of nails crowded the room. The storekeeper, an older man with round spectacles, looked up from his ledger and froze a moment too long before clearing his throat. Ethan's voice cut through before anyone else could speak. "Need flour, coffee, salt. A bolt of cloth, too. Blue if you have it." The storekeeper blinked, nodded quickly, and moved to fill the order. Sanaa stood close, her hands folded in front of her, eyes darting over the goods. She hadn't been inside a store in months, not since before the raid that had taken her from her people. The sight of food stacked in order, of cloth folded neat, felt strange, almost foreign. When Ethan added boots, women's size 6, Sanaa's breath caught. She had not expected him to notice, but she realized he had measured her with his eyes days ago when she stepped across his cabin floor barefoot. The thought shook her more than the stairs outside. As they waited, the door swung open, and the ranch hand who had once held her rope stepped inside, smelling of whiskey even in the morning. His lip curled when he saw her. Then his eyes slid to Ethan. "Thought I got rid of that problem," he sneered. "Didn't figure you for the type to waste good coin." Sanaa's stomach turned, and for a heartbeat she felt herself back in the yard again, her wrists burning under coarse rope. Ethan stepped forward once, not fast but solid, planting himself between her and the man. His voice stayed low even. You took your money. That was the end of it. Leave it there. The ranch hand spat on the floorboards. She'll bring you nothing but trouble. Ethan's eyes didn't move from his. Then it'll be my trouble. His tone left no room for debate. The storekeeper cleared his throat loudly, setting the bundle of flour and coffee on the counter. The tension eased as the ranch hand muttered curses and stomped back outside. Sanaa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands trembling as she tried to hide them in her shawl. Ethan paid, gathered the supplies, and nodded toward the door. Outside, faces still watched, but no one stepped forward. He loaded the goods onto the mule and helped Sanaa into the saddle again. Before she could settle her shawl, he leaned in close enough for only her to hear. You're safe with me. They can look, but they can't take you. She swallowed hard and nodded. The words did not erase her fear, but they steadied her. For the first time since the yard, she believed she might not have to face those jeers alone again. They rode out of town slowly, dust rising behind them, the weight of eyes fading with each mile. Sanaa sat taller in the saddle than she had when they arrived, her grip less tight on the horn. Ethan rode close at her side, his silence steady as ever. She knew now why people obeyed his quiet words, because he meant them. Back at the cabin, as the sun set behind the ridge, Sanaa carried the bolt of cloth to the table and ran her hands across its smooth surface. It was hers, bought not with shame but with care. She traced the edge with her fingers, feeling a small, fragile sense of belonging take root. For the first time, she began to imagine that the cabin might not only be his home. It could become hers too. The days after the trip to town settled into a rhythm, a slow pattern that wrapped around the cabin and made it feel less like a stopgap and more like a place to belong. The new supplies filled the shelves, the bolt of blue cloth folded neatly on the table until Sanaa cut it into pieces with steady hands. Her stitches were even, practiced from years of making do, and soon a dress began to take shape. Ethan noticed the way her posture changed when she tried on the first time. Her shoulders straighter, her chin lifted just slightly. She had burned the torn dress with her own hands in the fire pit behind the cabin, the smoke rising as if sealing away a chapter that would not return. That act alone had raised questions in the minds of any who had seen her in town. Where had she come from? What had she endured? How'd she ended up tied for sale? But neither Ethan nor Sanaa gave answers, and so the questions were left to fade. The cabin worked because both of them moved without needing to speak much. Ethan split wood and hauled water, his axe thudding against the block while Sanaa fed the stove and kept the beans boiling. He mended harness leather at the table in the evenings, while she sewed by the firelight, her fingers precise and unhurried. She began to hum, sometimes when she thought he wasn't listening, low tunes from her people that carried a note of memory and grief. Ethan didn't ask about them, but he heard, and the sound made the cabin feel less hollow. One question had lingered in the minds of those who watched them ride away from town. Was she staying with him by choice, or was this another form of captivity? Sanaa had asked herself the same thing in the quiet of the nights. But as she laid out food without being told, as she pulled weeds in the small patch of ground behind the corral, as she chose to place Ethan's mended coat by his chair, the answer began to settle. She stayed because she wanted to, because the cabin gave her something she had not felt since before the raids: control over her own steps. Ethan noticed the change too. He was not a man given to soft thoughts, but he felt the shift in the air. He no longer found her waiting for orders, no longer saw the guarded flinch in her every move. When he laid another blanket across her shoulders at night, she no longer stiffened, but instead adjusted it around herself and let her breathing fall into steady rhythm. The trust came in increments built not on words, but on presence. Still, questions remained. Questions anyone listening to the story might ask. Where's her family? Did she still have people out there searching? Would someone come to claim her? Sanaa thought of it often, though she never spoke it aloud. She had been taken from her camp 3 months ago when raiders drove her people into the hills and scattered them. She did not know if they had survived, and if they had, she doubted they would come searching in white towns. The ache of not knowing stayed sharp, but the work of each day dulled it enough to live. Ethan, for his part, never pressed her past what she was ready to say. He had his own ghosts: men lost in war, a brother buried in Missouri, land burned under cavalry fire, and he knew silence could be kinder than questions. The storm came at the end of the week, rolling sudden from the horizon, bringing hard rain and wind that rattled the roof. Together they pulled canvas over the seams, hammering nails into shingles while water ran down their faces and soaked their shirts. Sanaa's hair clung to her cheeks, her hands raw from gripping the hammer Ethan had passed to her, but she did not stop. She held her place beside him until the job was done. When they ducked back inside, dripping, Ethan built the fire high, and Sanaa stripped the wet shawl from her shoulders, hanging it over the chair. They both stood there for a moment, catching their breath, the heat of the fire pushing steam from their clothes. Their eyes met, not in startle or question, but in quiet acknowledgement. They had faced the storm together, and the cabin stood. That night, they ate in silence, the rain hammering on the roof, steam rising from their mugs of coffee. Ethan reached across the table and set his hand lightly on hers. He didn't hold it long, just long enough for her to turn her palm and let their fingers line up, steady, unforced. No one outside could see it, but in that small room, the gesture meant more than any words. Sanaa thought then about the $2 silver, how cheaply her life had been traded. She looked at Ethan and realized he had never once spoken of it since that day, never reminded her, never held it over her. The debt was not there. He had given her space to build herself back up. That knowledge sat deep in her chest, warming her more than the fire. When the rain finally eased and the stove ticked as it cooled, Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with fatigue, and Sanaa folded the blue cloth neatly on the table for the morning's work. The cabin no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place being made. The storm broke into a clear morning, the ground damp, the air sharp and clean. For the first time in weeks, the cabin smelled not of dust, but of rain-soaked wood and wet earth. Sanaa rose early, her hair still heavy from the night before, and set beans to boil while Ethan stepped out to check the corral. When he came back inside, his boots muddy, she noticed he was limping harder than usual, his jaw tight as he pulled off his hat. She had seen him move stiff before, but hadn't asked. Now the question pressed at her until she spoke. "Your leg, was it hurt in the war?" Ethan froze, surprised she'd broken the silence. He set his hat on the table, eyes on the stove fire. "Bullet at Shiloh. Never healed right. Weather makes it worse." His voice was plain, but the weight behind it was clear. Sanaa nodded once, understanding more of the quiet he carried. That detail answered the question many would have asked: why a man strong as him lived alone, far from town, without family or company. His limp kept him slow, and his ghost kept him distant. Days passed into a rhythm again, but the nights changed. Sanaa had begun to sleep lighter, her body no longer collapsing into exhaustion the way it once had. She woke often, her breath racing, her mind dragging her back to the yard, the rope, the jeers. She would stare into the dark until her chest eased, sometimes clutching the blanket until her hands cramped. Ethan, though he never said it, always heard. His chair would creak, and he would speak from the shadows. "You're all right. You're safe here." The words weren't gentle or soothing, just steady, spoken like truth that didn't need decoration. One night, she woke with a sharp cry caught in her throat, sweat damp on her skin. The fire burned down to embers. Ethan rose from his chair and stepped closer, not fast, not looming. He stopped at the edge of the bed and waited. Sanaa's chest heaved, her hands trembling as she pulled the blanket tighter, but then slowly she reached out, placing her hand over his. Her voice shook. "Stay." He sat on the edge of the bed, his weight sinking the mattress, his hand resting at her waist above the blanket. He didn't move beyond that, didn't press closer. She steadied her breathing, holding onto that hand like a tether. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of wind outside and the slow rhythm of their breaths. She felt her fear ease, not because it was gone, but because it had someone to lean against. Ethan spoke after a long while. I won't hurt you. I know, she whispered, though her throat tightened. It wasn't just belief, it was choice. She chose to say it. As the night deepened, she turned toward him, her forehead brushing his shoulder. He lowered his head slightly, his lips pressing against her hair, a touch light and hesitant. It was the first time his affection showed itself unguarded, not an accident of hands brushing over bread or blankets, but a choice made in the open. She tilted her head, her cheek brushing against his jaw, and their lips met in a slow, tentative kiss. It wasn't practiced or smooth. It was cautious, careful, but was theirs. The questions anyone listening might ask. Did he buy her to take her? Was she bound to give herself? Was this just another trade? Found their answer here. No money, no rope, no demand. Just a woman choosing to lean in, and a man steady enough to let her decide the pace. They lay back without breaking the fragile line of trust between them. Ethan stretched onto the bed, leaving space, his arm resting lightly across her waist. She placed her hand over his, holding it there. Their breathing fell into rhythm, her eyes closing not from exhaustion, but from calm. For the first time in months, Sanaa drifted into sleep with someone beside her and no fear of what morning would bring. Ethan lay awake a while longer, his thoughts circling. He had not wanted company, had not planned for any life beyond his cabin and the small herd in the corral. Yet here she was, a presence that had begun to change everything without forcing it. He stared at the low glow of the stove and admitted to himself what he hadn't spoken aloud. He wanted her here, not out of pity, not out of debt, but because the silence was different with her in it. When sleep finally came for him too, the cabin was quiet, the storm a memory, and the night no longer a place of fear, but the beginning of something steady neither of them had dared imagine. The days after that night passed with a quiet rhythm that felt different from the weeks before. Sanaa moved through the cabin, no longer with hesitation, but with a steady purpose, folding laundry by the stove, preparing food before Ethan even asked, humming while she worked. Ethan noticed the change, but did not call it out. He let her find her place without interference, the same way he had once learned to scout a trail in silence, never rushing a step for fear of breaking it. Questions anyone listening might have. Was she truly free to stay, or simply trapped in another man's walls? Were answered in the way she carried herself. She could have walked away from the cabin now, if she had chosen. The desert was hard, but not impossible. Yet she stayed, night after night, beside the man who had bought her freedom with 2 silver coins. And Ethan, for his part, never once reminded her of the trade. In his mind, the matter had ended the moment the rope had been cut. The work of spring carried on. Fences needed mending. The small herd in the corral needed checking, and the patch of ground behind the cabin had to be cleared for planting. Sanaa worked beside him, pulling weeds, her hands raw from the earth, but her back straight. She found herself watching him when he bent to check the soil, his broad shoulders moving beneath his shirt, his limp slowing him but never stopping him. He noticed her watching once and gave the faintest smile before returning to work. It startled her. He had not smiled at all in the first weeks. Late one afternoon, with the sun burning low, 2 riders appeared on the ridge above the wash. Ethan saw them first, the dust trailing behind their horses. His jaw tightened, though he said nothing until they came close enough for Sanaa to hear the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. One man was the ranch hand who had sold her, his face still red and bloated with drink. The other wore a deputy's badge on his vest, though the metal was scratched and dull, like it had seen more saloons than jails. Sanaa felt her throat close, the memory of the rope burning back through her skin. She froze in the yard, the bucket she had been carrying slipping from her hands and clattering against the hard dirt. Ethan stepped in front of her without thinking, his hand resting near his belt, but not on the Colt holstered there. He didn't need to draw. His stillness was its own weapon. The ranch hand spat into the dust. You owe me, Cole. That woman wasn't yours to take. I want her back, or I want more money. His voice was loud, trying to reach past Ethan to Sanaa. The deputy shifted uneasily in the saddle. There have been complaints, he said, though his tone held little conviction. about stolen cattle, about women being kept against their will. I need to hear her say she's here by choice. Sanaa's chest heaved, fear clawing at her throat. For a moment, she thought she might not be able to speak at all. The memory of the trading yard was too fresh, the jeers too close. But then she looked at Ethan's back, steady as stone, his shoulders squared against both men, and she found her voice. "I stay because I choose," she said, her words firm though her hands trembled at her sides. The deputy's gaze lingered on her, searching for doubt. But her eyes met his, unwavering now. He gave a single nod, then turned to the ranch hand. "You took money for her. That's the end of it. If you got a complaint, file it with the judge, if you can spell your name." The ranch hand swore, his face twisting, but he knew better than to push. He yanked his horse's reins and spat once more into the dirt before wheeling away, cursing under his breath. The deputy tipped his hat toward Ethan and Sanaa. "Look after each other," he said, then rode off slow behind the other man. When the dust settled, Sanaa realized she was still clutching her skirts tight in both fists. She let out a shuddering breath she hadn't known she was holding. Ethan turned then, meeting her eyes, and for once he spoke more than a sentence. "No one takes you from here. Not while I'm standing." Sanaa's throat tightened, not with fear now, but with something else, something steadier. She stepped closer, her forehead resting against his chest for just a moment, her breath shaking against him. He didn't move to hold her, didn't crowd her. He just stood solid, letting her lean until her strength returned. Inside the cabin that night, with the fire glowing steady and the wind carrying only the sound of coyotes in the distance, Sanaa sat at the table while Ethan sharpened his knife. She watched him in silence, her thoughts circling. She had expected men to come. She had feared it every day. But now that it had happened and passed, she knew the truth. Ethan would not let anyone take her back to chains, and she herself would never again be silent in front of those who tried. The fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of being alone. It was the fear of losing what she had found, that, she decided, was worth fighting for. The days after the deputy's visit carried a different weight. Sanaa noticed it each time Ethan stepped out to the corral with his rifle slung casually in his hand, and each time she caught herself glancing toward the ridge, half expecting riders to appear again. But no one came, and the silence that followed brought a fragile peace. Still, the question lingered for anyone who might hear their story. What tied her to him now, beyond fear of the world outside? Would she leave if given the chance, or stay because she chose? That answer began to take shape in what they did next. Ethan rose early one morning and told her plainly, "We're riding to the county seat. I want it down on paper. No one can twist it then." His tone was flat as always, but Sanaa heard the meaning beneath it. The paper wasn't for him. It was for her, to keep men from dragging her back with lies. She studied his face for a long moment before nodding. "I'll go." The ride was longer than the trip into town, 2 hours of dust and sun over the open trail. Sanaa sat straight in the saddle, her shawl pulled tight against the morning wind. Ethan rode beside her, his limp showing in the shift of his weight, but his pace never faltered. She thought then about the man who had once cut her free. He had no reason to take more trouble onto himself, yet he had, and now he was leading her toward a choice that would decide both their lives. The county seat was busier than the small town near their cabin. Wagons crowded the street, men shouting deals over bales of hay, women carrying baskets, children darting between horses. Sanaa felt the same knot in her stomach she had felt that first trip, but this time she carried herself differently. Her dress, sewn from the bolt of blue cloth, fit her shoulders well. The boots Ethan had bought supported her steps. She walked at his side, not behind, and though eyes still followed, she met them without lowering her head. Inside the courthouse, the clerk eyed them over his spectacles but asked no questions. Ethan explained in his steady voice that the woman beside him lived with him by choice, and he wanted it written down clear. The clerk dipped his pen, scratched words onto the paper, and slid it across the desk. Ethan signed without hesitation, his name bold and practiced. Sanaa hesitated only a moment before she took the pen, her hand trembling as she formed the letters of her name. Letters she had not written in years, but letters she remembered all the same. When she set the pen down, something settled in her chest. That detail answered what listeners might have wondered, whether Sanaa was truly free to choose. She had spoken it before a deputy, and now she had written it for the county. No one could claim her again without breaking the law itself. Afterward, Ethan took her to the general store in town, quieter here than at their own. He bought flour and beans, then paused at the counter. "Got rings?" he asked the storekeeper. The man raised a brow, then opened a small wooden box. The rings were simple, plain bands of brass and silver. Ethan picked one without ceremony, paying in coins he could have used for tools. Sanaa stood beside him, her pulse quickening, uncertain what to say. That evening, back at the cabin, Ethan set the ring on the table between them. He didn't kneel, didn't soften his tone. He just said the truth as he saw it. "Stay with me for good. As my wife, if you want it." Sanaa stared at the ring, her breath shallow. She thought of the day in the yard, of the rope, of the laughter that had marked her as nothing. Then she looked at Ethan, the man who had never once treated her as property, who had placed paper in her hand and let her name stand beside his. Her voice was steady when she answered, "Yes, but as your equal." His lips twitched in the faintest smile. "As my equal." He slid the ring on her finger, his rough hands careful. She felt the cool metal warm against her skin, a weight that was not a chain, but a choice. The fire burned low, shadows moving on the cabin walls. Their eyes met across the small space, the silence heavy but not with fear. Sanaa reached across the table, her hand resting over his, and when he stood, she rose with him. Their first kiss by the fire had been hesitant. This one was certain, steady, drawn out in a way that left no doubt. Later, they lay together in the bed, the blankets pulled over them, the warmth of the stove fading into night. Ethan's hand rested at her back, Sanaa's breath steady against his chest. The intimacy was not rushed, not demanded, but slow, careful, and real. The question of whether she was his by trade or by choice no longer held. She was his because she had chosen it, and he was hers because he had opened his life to her. When sleep came, it was not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with the quiet certainty that they had built something lasting inside the walls of that cabin. Spring came soft and steady, the wash running fuller with snow melt, green shoots pushing through earth that had lain brown for months. The cabin no longer looked like a solitary outpost against the ridge, but like a place lived in, a place that carried laughter at the table and clothes drying on the line. Sanaa rose with the sun, tying her hair back as she stepped into the small garden she had planted behind the corral. Rows of beans and squash marked her care, the soil turned by her own hands. Ethan watched her once from the porch, the scar on his cheek catching the light, and he realized this was not the life of a man alone anymore. It was theirs. The question that many would have asked since the day he paid $2 silver, was she only bound to him by debt, by circumstance, had already been answered. The paper in the county clerk's office bore her name as clearly as his. The ring on her finger shone in the firelight, and every step she took around the cabin showed choice, not chains. Still, the townsfolk had their doubts. Whispers followed them when they walked the boardwalk together, men muttering that he had bought her, women shaking their heads. Ethan paid it no mind, and Sanaa, after weeks of holding her shoulders tight, learned to meet those stares without flinching. In time, the gossip dulled. People grew used to seeing them side by side. One clear morning, they rode back into town, not for supplies, but for the preacher. They stood before him in the small church with its plain wooden pews, the smell of beeswax candles and dust hanging in the air. A handful of townsfolk attended, curious more than kind. The deputy who had once come to their door leaned in the back, his hat low, watching with quiet approval. The preacher's words were short. "Do you take her, freely, to be your wife?" Ethan answered without pause. "I do." Then came the preacher's question to Sanaa. She held her head high, her voice firm. "I do." Ethan slid the ring back on her finger in the presence of the church and the law, and Sanaa felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with relief. No man could ever again claim her as property, not when she had spoken her vow in front of them all. She was wife, partner, equal. Afterward, Ethan bought a slice of pie from the cafe for each of them, and they ate it side by side at the counter while the townsfolk pretended not to stare. When they mounted up to ride home, Sanaa glanced back once, meeting the eyes of one of the women who had whispered about her weeks before. The woman didn't look away. Instead, she gave a small, uncertain nod, as if recognizing something had changed. The ride back was slow, the sun warm on their backs, the mules steady under the weight of their supplies. At the cabin, Ethan carried in the flour and coffee, while Sanaa spread the new lace he had bought across the table, smoothing it with her hands. She turned to him then, her eyes steady. "This is my home now." He answered simply, "Ours." That night they sat on the porch steps with mugs of coffee, watching the light fade across the ridge. The garden behind them rustled in the breeze, the cattle lowed softly in the corral, and the cabin walls glowed with warmth from the fire inside. Ethan reached for her hand, rough fingers closing gently around hers. "We're family," he said, voice low. Sanaa leaned her head against his shoulder, her lips curving into the smallest smile. "We are." The story that had begun in a yard filled with jeers and dust ended here, in the quiet of the desert, with two people who had chosen each other. There were no debts left, no ropes, no questions of whether she belonged. She was not the woman sold for $2 anymore. She was Sanaa Cole, wife, partner, and equal, and Ethan, once a man haunted by solitude, was no longer alone. The night settled soft around them, and with it came a certainty neither had dared believe in months before. They had found their life, and it would hold.